Hey y'all, I'm just gonna start this one with buckle up, because if you've already clicked on this video, you probably know how long it's gonna be. As of recording, I don't yet, but I will be shocked if this is not my longest of these videos yet, because there's a lot to cover. Now, before you get too intimidated, I do want to say that part of the reason that there is a lot to cover is because there's a lot of information, both that's been provided in the spotlight by the designer and that I want to cover, that makes this less intimidating, right? This is a comprehensible kit. It is just an extremely dense kit that manages to be both a complicated attacker and a very dangerous, difficult defender. And so we are going to have to go over both of those, and that's just inevitably going to swell the runtime here. I'm also probably going to change my voice halfway through because, I don't know, I'll probably need to break for tea. I'm definitely still sick here. But I will be doing what I can to get through this because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. Right off the bat, though, let's start with the attributes. We have a survivability of 2.5 here, and that's because Enchantress, especially as an attacker, is relatively flimsy in some senses until you get her spells up, and then she's borderline unkillable. Her damage of 3, her damage is pretty mediocre until you get her spells up, and then it's insane. Her ease of use at 2 is, if this is a difficult one, right? Because you can get decent to mediocre results out of her by literally doing nothing but combo and throwing special 2, and where it tells you, where it slows down the game to let you input the spells, just double tap, you'll auto cast a random damaging spell, you move on, right? You can get okay results out of that. Then there's like a mid-level where you choose to just memorize one spell from each school, which is not very difficult. And then you'll be able to access a fair amount of Enchantress's power. I would consider that probably what 85% of people need to learn to be able to feel like this is somebody they can use on offense. And then there's Mastery, where you actually know all 10 spells and keep track of them and when to use them, and that's ease of use like 0.5. So between all of those, sure, they add up to 2. I don't know. I'll let y'all be the judge. Utility of 4, I think, is very accurate. There's some powerful immunities, resistances, and that kind of stuff in this kit. That's just kind of standard with a defender, but again, you can access more through her spells, and so at her peak, her utility is very, very high. And then Defender Strength 5. We already talked about this. Most of y'all are aware if you're watching this. She's a very difficult defender. We will talk about how to deal with that because she is a manageable defender, but she's very much one that makes you play her game her way. So keep that in mind. Getting right into the strengths and weaknesses, starting off with buff control flexibility. As it says here, she has access to nullify, neutralize, and atrophy. In a sense, she also has a 4th form because she can mess with the potency of certain buffs. Now, that one isn't included here because it also affects certain passives. It's not strictly buff control, but I bring it up here just because if you are dealing with the opponent's buffs, she has 4 different things that can mess with them depending on what you're looking at. If you've ever played somebody like Wiccan or Purgatory, who combines Neutralize with very sparse targeted Nullify, you know how strong that can be. So even though each of these individual methods of buff control isn't complete, that hopefully gives you some insight into just how much Amora can do when she has all of them up and running. Power advantage is a big one. She does have constant power steal. It will fall off if the opponent goes red, so it's not a get out of jail free card, but it does mean that on top of Mystic Dispersion, you are usually on the front foot in the fight. Very, very powerful, especially once you get Charm up. In long fights, her spells just stick around, right? There are ways to remove them, but if you're playing perfectly, they never fall off. There's no maintenance to them. You just get stronger and stronger and stronger. And then she does a ton of damage and is constantly healing and has all of her utility. So, as an attacker, very, very strong in long fights. And we'll go over that in more detail as we go. Now, the weakness is, like I said, if you're playing perfectly, the spells have no maintenance. But not all of us play perfectly most of the time, right? And especially as a defender, defenders basically never play perfectly. Haha, insert your jokes here, but you know what I mean. And so there are ways to remove her spells, and if those are going to come up in a fight one way or another, then she's going to be that much weaker. She also requires a lot of power, right? She has a power advantage throughout the fight, but she needs that because for her to feel powerful, she just has to burn through a lot of bars of power. If there's anything getting in the way of that, she's going to struggle a lot. And then Debilitate. This is just a hard RPG answer. There are skill ways to play around most of what Enchantress does, but she also is just always weaker if she has a Debilitate debuff on her. So any of that will be a problem. Now, moving on to the abilities themselves. We're going to start with what I tend to call just your standard defender, no, you can't do this list. She is a 5 out of 5 defender, and they tend to have this kind of section, right? This is just all the things that you might want to bring to turn things off and bypass and cheese her that, nope, you can't do that. So, starting off, her light and medium attacks deal energy damage and power steal up to 1% of her opponent's max power. This can't affect them if they have 3 bars of power, right? She is immune to power lock, and her ability and combat power rates can't be reduced below 50. This does mean that they can be reduced to 50 even if they have been increased above 100. So if you're dealing with her on like enhanced power gain, you can bring it all the way back down to 50, you just can't go lower, very similar to how Serpent's ability power rate works. When inflicted with an opposing champion's effect that would cause her to lose power, she passively gains the same amount of power back over 7 seconds. So this applies to Power Drain, Power Burn, Power Steal. It would apply to reversal of her own ability power rates if somehow somebody bypassed that floor on it, but hopefully that never happens. That would be very confusing. Anyway, if you try to power control her, it's not that it's not going to be worth anything, but you do definitely need to be careful about how you go about that, and you should expect it to only be so successful. She's going to gain some power. Charging a heavy attack after landing any non-combo ending basic inflicts a stun passive for 0.75 seconds, and then that heavy attack grants her no power. So this is very similar to America Chavez or Wasp or any of those other characters that can chain their basic combos into a heavy. Now, a large part of the reason that you need that ability for her is this next bullet. The first and second hits of her heavy attack prevent her from using her Special Attack 3 and Special Attack 2, respectively, until the heavy finishes. So this is basically to make sure that when you're trying to stack her spells with your Special 1 or cash out with your Special 2, you don't get pushed to the next bar and locked out of what you're trying to do, right? That's a problem with Mystics in general. It would be debilitating, pun intended, because I did see it coming, for her, right? So what this means is that her 3-hit heavy, the very first hit is going to lock her Special 3 and make it so that you can only use your Special 2 or Special 1, depending on which one you have. And then if you have 2 bars and only want to use your special 1, you wait for that second hit to land, and then that locks your special 2. Now you just have the special 1, right? And then if the heavy finishes, the heavy finishes. You knock the opponent down. But this gives you just that much more control over which special attack you are using. The reason this matters, I've hinted at a couple times, Enchantress uses her special attack 1 to cast spells. Casting a spell inflicts or grants a corresponding temporary effect. Spells themselves are indefinite and unaffected by ability accuracy. That line right there I think is probably going to confuse some people, because this does not mean the effect of the spells is indefinite. The duration of the effects of various spells is spelled out later, but what this means is that, like, you will cast an evocation spell, and that will give you 1 indefinite evocation spell. The specific spell you cast might be Fireball, and that's going to incinerate the opponent for a given duration, but you will hold on to that spell indefinitely. And then there are other things that allow you to recast spells that you already have active, and that's when you get the effect again. But this is a very important point to hold on to through this kit, is that the spells themselves and the effects of the spells are actually 2 different things. I'm just going to let that sit for a minute because I know it's weird. When she is struck by a special attack while 9 or more spells are active, she loses concentration and all of them are removed, and she deals a burst of direct damage to the opponent. Now, this is probably never going to happen on defense because you're probably already dead. If it somehow gets to that, you're going to be doing no damage to her long before she gets to 9 spells, but this is a pretty important thing to watch for when you're attacking with her. Like I said, there's not really a lot of upkeep other than not getting hit. Well, don't get hit once you get up to 9 spells, because you will feel unkillable, but that'll change real quick if you lose all of your stuff. Now, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and skip down in the spotlight, for those of you following along online, to the list of her spells. We will talk about these more later, but I just want to go over what the available effects are. She has 10 of these in her kit, and then the last 4 you see here are only available via Synergies. So let's just focus on those first 10. You have your 3 evocation spells, these orange spells. Fireball, Blizzard, and Chain Lightning. Pretty predictably, that's an Incinerate, Cold Snap, and Shock debuff, right? The Fireball, the Incinerate debuff, also inflicts an instant Incinerate. So you get a big boom to their health bar, and then it ticks down over time. Flavorful, right? The Cold Snap debuff also gives you a Frostbite passive. They have the same potency, so you're going to get damage over time and the ability to turn off Evade. That's really nice with this one. And then, boom, it'll do extra damage at the end because of the Frostbite. Chain Lightning gives you a Shock debuff, but the chain part is that this has a chance to re-inflict itself, and so a single shock can turn into a lot of shocks. So all 3 of these, the important thing to hold on to is that they are damaging debuffs that you know and recognize with a little twist. They are subject to immunity and resistance, as with other things, but those twists are going to be important, right? There are characters that are immune to Cold Snap, but not Frostbite. There are characters that resist Incinerate debuffs, but not instants, right? Those are the kinds of things that you are going to have to keep in mind against her. But if you have somebody who is just flat out immune to all of these effects, your life is going to be a lot easier for reasons we will get to later. But just put that on the shelf for now, right? Those 3 immunities are relevant. Next up, we have her Transmutation spells: Levitate, Haste, and Etherealness. Levitate allows her to evade attacks that would knock her down. Pretty specific ability, because you can eat all of a special attack, and this will only let you evade the very last hit. That's the one that would knock you down. but when she does so, she removes any stuns and recovers from special attacks and strikers, right? So this is a very powerful evade. It will get around a lot of things and just go, nope, you're okay now. Also, while this is up, she regenerates a portion of block damage. The potency of that we'll go over later, but the important thing here is just this is block regen. If you're focusing on an attacking Enchantress, this is what you get up to regen block damage. On defense, you have to process this as she'll evade if I try to knock her down. There's going to be a theme here, right? For an attacking Enchantress, there's going to be a piece of utility with these green spells. For a defending Enchantress, there's going to be a complication to hitting her. Haste lets her become passively unstoppable while dashing, like Rhino, and she becomes immune to reverse controls. So as a defender, you have to watch for that unstoppable when she's dashing. You can't intercept her unless you have an unstoppable counter. As an attacker, the reverse controls immunity is very relevant sometimes, right? Etherealness, you get an untouchable passive that gives a chance for incoming attacks to miss. This doesn't work on well-timed blocks, so it shouldn't mess with you as an attacking Enchantress, but it does obviously add some threat to a defending Enchantress. And then while this is active, she regenerates a portion of all energy damage taken, kind of like Wong, right? And so that's obviously a very relevant utility. That's one of the things that makes Wong so strong in Necropolis, is that energy damage regen. So that's the green spells. Then we move on to her enchantment spells. These next three, and then if she's awakened, also charm. So Dispel is a periodic nullify, kind of like Sorcerer Supreme's nullification aura. Antipathy is a neutralize, which just prevents or reduces the chance of buffs before they apply. Wilt is an atrophy passive like Kindred has, which is going to reduce the duration of new buffs. All three of those are powerful forms of buff control that you will want in certain fights or others. They are also all a little bit annoying if you are fighting Enchantress and she has them on you while you're trying to activate buffs, right? And then Charm, this is the new one, right? This is a completely new effect. Charm is a debuff that increases the potency of incoming power steal, drain, and burn effects, and decreases the potency of power gain, energize, and inexorable effects. So what this means is that she will inflict Charm on her opponent, and that is going to make any power steal or drain or burn applied to that opponent stronger, which will increase her power steal every time she hits them, right? And then the way power steal works is that the amount she gains is based on how much she steals. So she also is going to steal more, right? So very good for her, but it's also going to decrease the potency of the opponent's power gain, energize, and inexorable effects. Remember, buffs and passives. So even if you can't prevent them, even if you don't reduce their duration, you are reducing their potency. And this is something that is independent from ability power rate or combat power rate, right? Because think about it this way. I've talked about this before as a little bit of like there's the real thing, and then there's a lens, right? So there's the potency of a power gain effect. Let's say that the real thing is trying to give you 100 power every 10 seconds, right? If your ability power rate is cut in half, then that will reduce that 100 down to 50, right? But if the size of the real thing, if the potency of the power gain itself is cut in half, that will also reduce it to 50, right? So this is really important because this means that even against opponents that have increased ability power rates because of nodes or other things, Enchantress is still going to be able to reduce how much power they are gaining through this effect. So very strong. It's somewhat related to the vitality that's on Leader. I talked about that for the same reason. But I just want to shout out that this is something that nobody else has really done before as far as power control. We'll get to the other spells when we get to Synergies. I'm not going to worry about them here. Let's head back to the kit. So I'm actually going to focus on Enchantress as an attacker for now, so that we can talk through what these spells do and how they work, and then we will go back to her as a defender, right? So I just went through the spells. Let's go straight to the special one and talk about that. So as an attacker, after the first hit of the special one, time slows down. You can then swipe up, down, left, or right in any combination of 3 inputs, which is going to grant one of the spells in her spellbook. Once you do those 3 inputs, the time slowdown goes away and she casts that spell. You can also, like I said earlier, just double tap block or do something that isn't in her spellbook, and she'll just cast a random Evocation spell, which is one of the damaging ones, right? You can swipe on either the left or the right side of the screens, and while I don't recommend it in serious content, you do have access to the spellbook on the pause menu, right? So you can, while you're learning her especially, pause the game and go, hold on, what's Chain Lightning again? Okay, now I'm ready for this. You can theoretically even do this after you cast the special one, in that brief moment before the first hit, so that you can safely unpause after checking your work, and then cast the spell. Again, not something I would plan on in war or whatever, but just especially while you're learning her, it's nice to have that fallback. So, first thing with her Evocation spellbook, we already talked about what Fireball, Blizzard, and Chain Lightning do, but the big thing I want to point out here is that they all follow the same pattern. They're either up or down twice, and then a different third effect, right? So it's the same input twice, and then a different third input. And that first input is either up or down. That's not enough on its own. You do have to actually learn these, but that is how I organize it in my head. And as long as I think about, okay, Fireball is down, down, then it's not that hard for me to remember the out or the right. And then I remember Blizzard is just like that flipped. It's up, up, and then right. And then Chain Lightning is the different one. And I think up, up, then down. Which, I don't know, is maybe, hey, look at the sky, there's a lightning bolt coming down. Whatever helps you hold on to these spell combos, do it, right? I also mentioned earlier, if you're interested in trying to figure out Enchantress, kind of at that 85% level I mentioned, then within each of these spell books, in this case Evocation, just learn one of them, right? Like, literally just learn Blizzard, because that's the one that's going to have the most utility attached, because Cold Snap prevents evade, and it's going to run into the fewest immunities. And just learn the input for Blizzard and start there. You can always come back and learn the others, but literally just focus on, okay, this is the 3 key combo for Blizzard. That's what I need to hold on to in my brain. Now, all of these damaging effects, the Evocation spells, are inflicted by the final hit of her special attacks, and they do trigger through block. They have a set potency listed here over 10 seconds. That's not super strong by itself, but remember, each of them comes with something extra. The Blizzard comes with a Frostbite, the Fireball comes with an Instant Incinerate, and the Chain Lightning reapplies itself. And these can stack, right? You can have 3 or 4 Blizzards all active at the same time, so they will start to add up. As a defender, all of these effects are passives instead of debuffs. That's obviously an up of the threat, right? The answer to her is not supposed to just be someone who has access to Purify. You are supposed to actually play around her. That's where that is there. The removal trigger for Evocation spells is Intercept, right? As long as Enchantress isn't unstoppable, which remember, one of her spells makes her unstoppable while dashing, As long as she isn't unstoppable, intercepting her removes all evocation spells. So that's going to be really important on defense. We'll come back to that. But for now, despite all of this text, I want your takeaway from the Evocation Spellbook to be one of these 3 spells for use on offense, the fact that they go through block on the last hit of her special, and the fact that you intercept her to remove them, which also means as an attacker, you don't want to get intercepted, so be careful with that. I'm also going to zoom out here real quick and say I'm going over everything I can in this video, but there is a lot in the online spotlight, including videos and some nerdy Easter eggs in the dev notes for those of you who like that kind of thing. So I would recommend checking that one out. There's going to be a lot of that info. But for now, let's move on to Transmutation. We mentioned these earlier. These are the ones that give her utility as an attacker and some kind of protective effect as a defender. You'll also, again, notice an input pattern. All 3 of these are the exact same input 3 times. Levitate is up. Haste is to the right, which is all towards the opponent if you're the attacker. Etherealness is all to the left, which is away from the opponent as the attacker. So that works pretty well with Levitate protects you from being knocked down, Haste lets you dash forward, and Etherealness makes them miss you, right? Which is kind of like staying away from them. They're not that hard to remember, right? But again, as an attacker, if you want to start off easy with Enchantress, just pick one of these to learn. I personally would probably recommend Levitate because that's the one that gives you block regen, which I personally find very helpful. That said, maybe you want to feel comfortable intercepting with her, and so you focus on Haste. That's the one that you have in your personal spellbook alongside your Blizzard, because it just means that you can freely intercept without worrying about losing all of your orange spells, right? Very helpful. Now, as a reminder again, the effects of the spells and the spells themselves are separate, but the effects of transmutation spells last 20 seconds. So you have 20 seconds of that block regen, of that unstoppable on dash, of that untouchable, etc. If they have a potency or a chance, that value is 30%. So that means the untouchable is a 30% chance to miss. The block regen is 30% of block damage. The energy damage regen is 30% of the incoming energy damage, etc. They do not stack, unlike the damaging spells, and are removed when Enchantress has no active transmutation spells. That's going to sound weird, but remember there's a removal trigger. All active transmutation spells end when Enchantress's heavy attack is interrupted or punished. Now, what this means is that you might have 10 seconds left on haste, but if you punish Enchantress's heavy attack, or if you as an attacker have it punished, then you're going to lose the transmutation spell associated with haste, and therefore the effect of it, that reverse controls immunity, and that unstoppable is going to be removed, right? So the effects and the spells themselves are separate, but they are linked by that removal trigger. It's going to make more sense as you play her. There are, again, also videos attached to the spotlight. But for now, let's move on to the Enchantment Spellbook. I will talk more about all of these removal triggers when we get to defense, but for now, let's just leave it on the table over there. Enchantment is Dispel, Antipathy, Wilt, and Charm. These are all of the buff control spells, right? And you'll notice all of these are kind of an ABA input scheme. You have down, up, down, left, right, left, left, right, or Charm is up, down, up. And so these ones are pretty easy to hold in your brain. The 3 patterns are all very different from each other, and you can kind of remember them in groups like that. But again, I will personally recommend, if you only want to remember one enchantment spell, remember Charm, as long as your Enchantress is awakened, because that's going to allow you to throw more spells and ramp more quickly. So remember that up, down, up to boost your power steal. The effects of enchantment spells last 25 seconds, so these are the longest ones overall. They have a potency of 30%. They again do not stack, and again are removed when she has no active enchantment spells. So all active enchantment spells end when she is knocked down. So this is what you want to avoid if you're trying to hold on to your buff control. And if you want to stop her buff control as a defender, you knock her down. There are complications. I will get to them. Now, the reason you want to stack spells with the special one, and the reason I recommended holding on to one spell from each school as you're learning her, is because of how the special 2 works, right? The special 2 hits harder, it gains extra attack for each active spell up to a maximum of 12 spells. You can cast more spells, you just won't get any attack for them after that. And you get different effects for each category of spell that is tied for or at the highest number of active instances, right? So if you have 3 Evocation, 3 Transmutation, and 3 Enchantment spells, you will get all 3 of these benefits on top of the attack rating. But if you have 3 Evocation, 2 Transmutation, and 2 Enchantment, you will only get the Evocation bonus of extra critical rating, right? That's what that means. So like I just said, if Evocation is the highest or tied for the highest, you get extra critical rating for each active spell. The Evocation spells count twice for this extra critical rating, right? There is no cap on this because critical rating is subject to diminishing returns, so it just will fall off a bit as it gets higher, but you definitely feel this. If Transmutation is highest or tied for highest, you lifesteal a very small percentage of the damage dealt for each active spell. Again, Transmutation spells count twice for this lifesteal. This lifesteal maxes out at 1.8% of damage dealt. That's going to look tiny, I understand. But trust me, once she gets rolling, it is super consistent. She heals so much with the extra attack rating and the extra critical rating. You don't need to worry about this number being too small. I promise. If Enchantment is highest or tied for highest, you reactivate all of your active spells. So this means that you reactivate the damaging effects for all of your Evocation spells, you reactivate all of those utility effects from Transmutation, and you reactivate all of that buff control from Enchantment, and the Enchantment spells come back at double potency. So now, instead of a 30% charm, a 30% atrophy, a 30% neutralize, you have 60% on all of those, right? And this is why I said learn one spell from each school. Because if you only know Blizzard, Haste, and Charm, then you can just cast those 3 in order over and over again, and you can get to 6 overall spells and have 2 Blizzards, 2 Hastes, and 2 Charms, and you only need to memorize 3 spells, but then when you activate your special 2, you're going to get all of these bonuses, right? You're going to get the full attack rating, you're going to get the extra crit rating, the lifesteal, and the reactivation. You're going to get the stronger charm, you're going to reactivate the cold snaps and the frostbites, you're going to reactivate your reverse controls immunity, etc., right? And so it doesn't have to be those 3. That was a quick recommendation, but you could pick whatever 3 you think you're personally going to need the most. And just focus on one of each school and building them up in a balanced way so that you have an equal number of the 3 colors of spells when you go to your special 2 to keep everything online and cooking with gas. It's also very important to note that when you reactivate the damaging effects of the Evocation spells, they benefit from the increased attack rating and so are going to be much stronger on the special 2. Okay. Now that we've covered her as an attacker, and you can kind of see the goal here, you build up spells with special 1, balancing the 3 schools, cash out with the special 2, You hold on to Charm so that you have better power steal, so that once you feel like you're ramped enough, you just spam Special 2, and you feel like a god, right? Like the Spotlight says, you feel like an archmage. But now let's talk about defense, because that's pretty spooky too. So all of these effects are only active when Enchantress is a defender, right? For each active spell, 20% of all incoming damage is prevented. That means that if she has 5 spells up, she takes no damage. If any spells are still active at the start of her next special attack, then that prevented damage is added up and sent back at the attacker as direct damage. This is unaffected by ability accuracy. So that makes her very, very difficult to nuke down, right? Because you can't just ignore the spells. She will stop you being able to kill her by just taking no damage. She'll eventually get to a special attack, she'll throw it, and you will just fall apart, right? When I was testing this, there were a couple times when I did push my luck, ignore the spells, and think I could just close out a fight with somebody like Silk or Photon or something, and then boom, I just evaporated when she threw her special. This is what I mean when I say you have to play her game. She is manageable, but because it's so difficult to keep her off of her special attacks, you're going to run into this, and therefore you're going to need to remove her spells. Now, it's very important to note each debilitate effect, so both debuffs and passives, although thankfully no character has passives just yet, on Enchantress counts as a negative spell for the purposes of this ability. That means that, for each debilitate on them, 20% less damage is prevented, and less damage is returned. That means that if you can get her down to 1 spell left, and she has a debilitate on her, then it doesn't matter how much damage she stored when she had more than 1 spell. You've gotten down to where she effectively has 0, right? Because the 1 active spell minus the 1 debilitate is 0, and therefore when she activates her special, she won't reflect anything. That's a really important point. The debilitate counts as a negative spell both as she's storing damage and as she's trying to reflect the stored damage. So you don't have to worry about your debilitates matching her spells. If you're trying to use a character with this effect to slow her down, you just need to get her spell count down to where it matches your debilitates. And that's a very important point, because I think there's nobody in the game right now with more than 2 stacks of it. Those 2 stacks being on Classic Spidey, and then there are a couple other characters with it, such as Titania or Luke Cage, right? At the start of each fight, and when using her special 1, remember this is all as a defender, Enchantress casts a predefined combination of 3 spells at random, which depletes 60% of her current power. That's a weird wording there, but what that means is that if she casts her special 1, even while she has 3 bars of power, it'll cost her a bar of power to throw the special, and then when she casts her special 1, that's going to deplete 60% of her remaining power. This is just to kind of keep things under control. She is going to use her special 1, because if this next bullet, until she's thrown her special 1 2 times, she can't throw her special 2. So that means she is going to throw that special 1. But you also don't have to worry about her throwing 2 special 1s completely back to back, because casting the spells depletes power. And that's very important, because if that wasn't there, and she didn't deplete her own power when she did this, you would be more likely to run into something where she throws a special 1 while she has a bleed effect on her, and then instantly throws another special 1, and the stored damage from her reducing that bleed would get reflected, and that just wouldn't be fun, right? You can still come close to that if you're not careful with Mystic Dispersion, but I want to call out the function that serves within the kit. So like we said, she doesn't have access to her special 2 until she's thrown her special 1 twice, and then this resets after she throws her special 2. This is important because it means you can't just push her to the special 2 and laugh. You can't avoid the threat of the spells with that. She is going to cast the special 1, and so you have to respect it. Additionally, her ability and combat power rates are reduced by 20%. Reminder, they can still be reduced further, just not below 50%, but this just makes her that much less terrifying on defense because while she still will have a lot of power, it's going to be significantly less, and you don't have to worry about the full effect of Mystic Dispersion. Unless she's on a node that is juicing her power rate further, she's always going to gain 80% of the power somebody else would from a buff expiring, and that is extremely relevant. So, now let's talk about these combinations of spells. This is listed on the Spotlight if you want to check it out. You don't have to memorize these, right? You will find yourself, the more you play her, kind of soft memorizing these, but you don't need to. What's important is understanding the way the removal triggers interact. We talked about this a bit on offense, but as a refresher, Evocation spells, which are the orange ones that deal damage, those are removed by intercepting Enchantress. Transmutation spells, which are the green utility ones, are removed by interrupting or punishing her heavy attack. And Enchantment spells, which are the purple buff control ones, are removed by knocking her down. Now, I will point out some interactions there. You can technically intercept Enchantress with an attack that knocks her down. You can combine those two. You can heavy counter her, and thus both interrupt her heavy and knock her down at the same time, but there are some complications. So let's go over these spell combinations and talk about how to diffuse each of them one at a time. For starters, we have Fireball, Chain Lightning, Blizzard, the 3 damaging spells. This one's very simple. You don't want to let the last hit of the special 1 strike your block when you see these 3 pop up, because it's going to really, really hurt. But once these effects are up, this one is pretty simple. You just have to intercept Enchantress, and all of the spells go away. The storing and reflecting damage part of her kit is completely removed with a single trigger. The counterpart there, of course, is that if you do block the whole special 1, you're going to take a lot of dot damage. But there's some trade-offs there, right? The second combo is Fireball, Chain Lightning, and Haste. So you have 2 damaging spells that can trigger through block, both of which can be removed by an intercept, but then you also have Haste, which makes her unstoppable while dashing. So that means that you have to deal with Haste first, right? Either that, or you have to have a slow effect on her to prevent the unstoppable. Then you could intercept to remove the evocation spells. But the idea here is that each of these spell combos is a bit of a puzzle. And as long as you remember the 3 removal triggers, that's what you have to pay attention to. You do have to know what haste means, because you have to remember that haste is the one that means you can't intercept her freely. This combination requires you to bait out her heavy attack, punish it to remove haste, and then intercept to remove the evocation spells. But you're going to have to do it specifically in that order most of the time. The next one is Chain Lightning, Blizzard, and Etherealness. This one is a bit tricky. Anything with Etherealness is automatically more tricky. I'm going to say that ahead of time. Those 3 combos are the ones that should scare you. But let's talk about this one first. So again, we have 2 evocation effects that are removed by intercept. You can just go for that, except that Etherealness gives you a chance to miss. So if you have a miss counter, even if it's just on your medium, like somebody like Photon, you can go ahead and intercept and remove those 2 evocation spells. Similarly to the previous one, you can also bait out her heavy, interrupt or punish it, and then go for the intercept. But that chance to miss does happen to an attack that punishes her heavy. And it makes it very risky to intercept her heavy when Etherealness is up. Because if she starts her heavy attack, and you try to interrupt her in between the first and second hit of her heavy, and that hit misses, then you are not going to have time to react before the second hit of her heavy hits you, and then you're going to be eating the whole heavy. And that's gonna stink. So when Etherealness is a factor, the way to play around it if you don't have a miss counter is to wait out the entire heavy and then just very quickly go in and try and tap her once. Because remember, there's only a 30% chance to miss. So more often than not, punishing her heavy is going to land, is going to remove Etherealness, and then you're safe to intercept her. But if it does cause miss, you are going to have just that split second to back off before she recovers and punishes you. And that is really key to master that timing so that you have safe windows to try and disarm it, even without a miss counter. All of these combos with Etherealness are why it is so nice to have a miss counter when fighting Enchantress, because it means that you just don't have to play that game of, will this heavy punish actually hit her? Will it actually remove the green spells? Because if you have a miss counter, it just will. So that is one of the more important pieces of utility to feel comfortable against her. Next up, we have Fireball, Levitate, and Dispel. So this is one of all three, right? We have an Evocation, a Transmutation, and an Enchantment. This means you have to hit every removal trigger. Now, my personal recommendation for efficiency here is bait out her heavy and heavy counter that, right? As long as you don't have a one-hit heavy, that's the important part. One-hit heavies are actually a disadvantage against Enchantress. But as long as you have a two-hit heavy, when you heavy counter her, the first hit will be one that punishes her heavy and therefore removes Levitate. And then the second or final hit will be one that knocks her down, removing Dispel. Then you can go to intercept her and remove Fireball. However, if you have a one-hit heavy, then your heavy will be an attack that tries to knock her down and Levitate will trigger. So one-hit heavies only work if you have a non-ability accuracy way of stopping her from evading. So calling out that fun little wrinkle. This is probably also a good time to point out, as you're doing this, as you are looking for places to intercept, as you are baiting out heavies, it is possible for her to be gaining power through Mystic Dispersion or some other means. And so yes, it is challenging to deal with these specials before she gets to her next bar of power. That is the threat. And that is why having somebody with access to even one stack of Debilitate, like Titania or Luke, is so good. You don't need it. I've played around her quite a bit with other characters, but I just want to call that out. Debilitate, like some form of anti-miss, is very helpful in making this whole little mini-game here less stressful. Next up, we have Etherealness, Wilt, and Antipathy. So the important thing to note here is that you have Etherealness again, which means that you have to deal with that mischance, and then you have two buff control things. This can make your dex buff fail, which grants her power, so you do have to respect the buff control. And this one is particularly spooky in the corner because you're going to keep dexing her heavy and keep failing to trigger your dex buff and keep giving her power. That's the spooky one, right? So there is real threat here. But in a lot of ways, it's simpler than the previous one, because if you bait out her full heavy, punish it, remove Etherealness, and then land a heavy attack or special to knock her down, you've covered all of your bases. If you have somebody who has a miss counter, then you can just go directly for the heavy counter, right? Because as long as you're sure your heavy won't miss, heavy countering her heavy will interrupt her heavy, removing Etherealness, and to knock her down, removing Wilt and Antipathy. Again, it's not super important to know what all of the spells do individually. What is important is to know the 3 categories of spells, which are color-coded, and their removal triggers. Orange is intercept, green is interrupt or punish heavy, purple is knock down. And then I think you probably do need to know specifically what the 3 green spells do. It is important to know the difference between haste, etherealness, and levitate, as you're seeing here, because unstoppable, evade, and miss are 3 different threats that require different kinds of counterplay. Next up, we have levitate, haste, and etherealness. This is the one that starts to feel like you just can't touch her, right? Because she has a chance to evade, she'll go unstoppable when dashing, and there's a chance to miss. But all it takes is punishing her heavy once to get rid of all of them at the same time. And if you have somebody with a miss counter, that's actually pretty simple. The last combo here is Dispel, Wilt, and Antipathy. This one is all of her buff control at once, so that part can be very scary, but it's also by far the simplest to remove. You can just parry heavier, right? Or throw a special attack, knock her down. You don't have to worry about any of that. And remember, these are the only combinations of spells that show up on defense. So while there are 10 spells overall, and technically all 10 of them do show up here, like I said, the important thing is knowing her 3 removal triggers and knowing what her 3 green spells mean, because those green spells are going to affect the order in which you go for the removal triggers. And as long as you understand those 2 things, it's not that bad to disarm Enchantress's spells before she gets to her next special, again, because of that text where she consumes her own power to cast her spells. She is dangerous, I don't want to understate that. But this is manageable, right? You're basically forced to play this minigame, but if you learn the rules, she is someone that you can get through pretty efficiently with a number of attackers, especially strong science attackers. Alright, moving on to the Special 3. The Special 3 inflicts a non-stacking 25% charm debuff for 50 seconds, which, it's important to note, doesn't stack with itself, but does stack with the charm enchantment spell that you can cast with the Special 1, so you can have access to a very strong set of charm effects here. You can have the 60% from the SIG, you can also have the 25% from the Special 3. That's very strong power control. And you also power steal up to 1 bar of power, which then is going to allow you to either immediately throw another Special 1, or be that much closer to a Special 2. Because, as the dev notes point out for this one, the charm debuff is inflicted first, which means that the power steal here is actually 1.25 bars of power, or if you have a boosted charm debuff from the SIG, then it can actually be 1.85 bars, which gets you very close to another Special 2. This also means that while you can technically push her past the Special 1, past the Special 2, to the Special 3, and use somebody with an indestructible effect or boost to try and get around the threat of her Special 1, unless the person you're doing that with is themselves power steal immune, she's probably going to then immediately throw a Special 1 when you come out of the Special 3 animation, which means it's probably not worth doing that, right? So then we have the signature ability. This is what turns on your ability to use the charm spell, and is, I think, probably the single biggest reason that you want her awakened if you plan to use her as an attacker. Her enchantment spell effects last an additional 10 seconds, which gives her better buff control when awakened. And then you have a mostly defensive threat here, but also an ability that can speed up your rotation on offense. Whenever a buff fails to activate on the opponent for a reason other than chance, that means this catches both neutralizes, ability accuracy failure, and immunity, or they are immune to a damaging effect, Enchantress instantly power steals 4% of their max power. As an attacker, this potency is reduced by 75%, meaning it's power stealing 1% of their max power. So it's the same as what you get on your lights and mediums as an attacker. But as a defender, this is pretty important, because this means that just dexing, even with a buff immune, is going to give her power. if you're not careful, so you have to be significantly more deliberate with your choices there. And it also means that if you are using somebody who is immune to all of her stuff to just indiscriminately block the special one and not worry about those damaging effects, she's also going to have a little bit extra power. Now, I'm not saying that that means it isn't worth it, right? Avoiding Mystic Dispersion entirely, or avoiding needing to dex the final hit of the special one and thus proc Mystic Dispersion or risk taking that damage, are still things that can be very worth the trade. It's just not quite as simple against her because of this bullet in the SIG as it might be otherwise. It's also very important to note that this immunity to a damaging effect clause is not restricted to her damaging effects. This does apply to things like Hazard Shift. And so, again, while that very well may still be the correct way to answer her, is to just deal with that immunity, you're going to have to be very careful here. If you're using someone who is immune, you probably want them to be immune to Power Steal, so somebody like Cassie or Photon, or you want them to be somebody who is mitigating what she gains from the Power Steal, like Sandman, etc., as opposed to your standard just immune and hit the opponent. So do respect that ability against a high sig defending Enchantress, for sure. So before I get into the synergies, this maybe actually hasn't taken quite as long as I thought it would, but I want to stress again that both as an attacker and a defender, Enchantress is extremely complicated. You are allowed to tell me in the comments you think she's too complicated. But you don't need to know her whole kit to fight her or to fight with her. Like I said, you can get an awful lot out of her by memorizing one of each of the 3 kinds of spells, and then as a defender, you basically need to understand you can't let the last hit of the special one hit your block, you need to know your 3 removal triggers, and you need to understand your 3 transmutation spells because they mess with your removal triggers. If you know those 7 things, you can fight Enchantress. There are other wrinkles that will make you better, but if you know those 7 things, you can fight Enchantress. And specifically, as we talked about, if you have somebody with a miscounter, or with Debilitate, or to a lesser extent, with Anti-Unstoppable or Anti-Evade, then that's going to make her that much easier to counter. Immunities, or better yet, strong resistances, are also going to be helpful for her. Power Steal immunity is potentially helpful for her. Buff immunity isn't as helpful as it might be, but it's still helpful. All of those things make it easier, but the core challenge is knowing those 7 things. Beware the last hit of the special one, removal triggers, transmutation spells. Try to remember that as you're getting your butt kicked in EQ the first time you face her. Because there probably will be a bit of that, right? She is still a 5 out of 5 defender, but just try and organize that those are the things you're focused on learning. And I think her learning curve won't be as steep as it otherwise could be. So, now let's talk about synergies. You're going to see another pattern here. All of these synergies add new spells to her spellbook. Most of them fit the established patterns. First up with Loki and Hela, all 3 of these hate the mighty thunder god, and so Enchantress gets a new spell, Flesh to Stone, which is a Petrify passive. It does not apply against robots, but because this is one of your purple spells, that means it's a 30% Petrify that can be doubled to 60% with the special 2, so pretty powerful, especially when combined with Charm. This one isn't an ABA input, so it's a little bit harder to recognize or to memorize, but you at least do have the fact that the first 2 inputs are opposite of each other to hold on to. Hela gets additional spirits on her sword attacks, which is very helpful for her. And the first hit of Loki's heavy attack prevents him from using his special 2 and 3 until the heavy finishes. So this allows Loki to use that very powerful buff steal on his special 1 more reliably even as he's gaining power. Crystalline Prison with Valkyrie gives Enchantress shield. This is another transmutation spell and follows the pattern by just being down, down, down. This one is a bulwark buff. The shield lets her block. Funny that. And then Valkyrie gets extra block proficiency while her combo is inverted, which is generally a nice thing, but for Valkyrie specifically, that is going to increase her chance to purify before she gets fully ramped, and is going to make her that much better at dealing with non-dots. Sisters in Hood with Lady Deathstrike, Psylocke, and someone is going to give Enchantress Poison Spray, which is a new Evocation spell. It follows the same pattern of 2 vertical inputs and then a third different input. This one is unsurprisingly going to be poison passives, and it gives you 3 of them, so there's also some healing control involved there. Lady Deathstrike, once per fight while Ferocity is active, it does not unpause when blocking an attack, so that makes her that much easier to play. And then for Psylocke, when she consumes a side charge, she has a 50% chance for it to be refunded, which is obviously very good when she's doing her heavy spam nonsense. No sharing the stage with a coming soon champion that I'm sure at least one person will guess correctly. Enchantress gets access to another enchantment spell, Reduce Reflexes. This one doesn't really fit the pattern either, but it does have that inverted first 2, so it is at least similar to Flesh to Stone, and that's going to inflict a Decelerate debuff. So similarly to the others, that's going to be 30%, doubled up to 60%. Pretty good anti-evade and anti-unstoppable. Then we have Charmed, I'm sure, with Onslaught, Vision, and the Hulk, because somehow her charm abilities have worked on a robot, a pure psionic entity, and a giant green rage monster, because that's just how good she is at this. I'm not going to rant about comics lore. Anyway, Enchantress's charm effects last an additional 10 seconds, which makes her better both with the special 3 and with her sig. And the other synergy champions here get extra attack rating, but minus 20% attack rating when fighting Enchantress. Now, this is a weird one, because this actually means that if you have Enchantress on your team, and Onslaught, Vision, or Hulk, but then you are facing Onslaught, Vision, or Hulk with someone other than Enchantress, they're going to hit harder, right? So if you have Enchantress, Hulk, and then like Kate Bishop on the team, and you use Kate to fight Hulk, he's actually going to hit harder. I know that's weird. The flavor is probably worth it most of the time because you're not going to be running into those situations too often, but I want to shout out that wrinkle just in case it gets somebody tripped up. And then with Thor and Heimdall, she has a romance synergy that gives all characters on the team extra combat power rate. And then as far as relics go, she has damaging effects, she has ability power. I think the Ghost Rider relic is probably going to be the one that you want to go with, because she does have spells and not blessings, and so isn't going to fit exactly with the Scarlet Witch relic, but there are going to be parts of that are good for her too. She even goes unstoppable in regens, so you could use the Juggernaut relic. I think Ghost Rider is going to be best, but relics are always an opportunity cost thing, so experiment, do what makes the most sense to you. I will say, as far as stat focus, I would probably recommend special damage on her, because once you really get going, you could go for crit damage, but I don't know that that's going to be super important. For the most part, your damage and your lifesteal is going to be during the special 2, when you already have really high crit rate. So crit rate doesn't matter for her. The crit damage is, I think, normally about a 4% increase, depending on diminishing returns, whereas the special damage is going to be an 8% increase, which is then an 8% damage to your lifesteal as well. So I think I would go ahead and recommend that now. Reminder that it will not increase the red numbers associated with her evocation spells. That is not how special damage stat focus works, but it still would be my choice for that reason. You could also just make her tankier, right? Go with one of the resistance ones instead to make it that much safer to ramp her. I think that's perfectly respectable. But at this point, I'm going to stop talking because I just realized I looked at the clock. And even though this felt like it went faster than I feared, yeah, this is going to be a long one. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here. That's Enchantress. Like I said, I think it's important to focus on processing her kit as an attacker and as a defender separately. Break it down into the things you need to learn those, and then learn the other nuanced stuff later. And I think you're going to generally have a better time with her. She's a very impressive character. She's dangerous on defense. She's incredibly strong on offense. When we were working on her, I did multiple Serpent boss kill fights. Like, we set him up on basically what was the Alliance War boss node, and I fought him there. She's very strong, and so I do think she is worth learning. You just know what you're in for after listening to this. So let me know in the comments what you think. I'm curious about this one. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and take care.